Okay, so my topic was Lunfardo as a social identity. And so what I did was I traced the history of Lunfardo as a slang in Buenos Aires. And I talked about how it was important to the immigrant communities and later on how that developed and became sort of an identity of Buenos Aires. And so I'll start off just by reading the introduction. I'm not going to read the whole paper, but it is nearly impossible to study the history of the Rio de la Plata region without delving into the complex social history that gave birth to the argot that grew to become Lunfardo. Argot is like a individual secret sort of slang. Growing out of the deep mixture of cultures and classes in Buenos Aires and the surrounding region, Lunfardo became the defining marker of the Bajo Fondo of Buenos Aires. This paper will trace the development of Lunfardo and highlight this, specifically how this argot grew to represent the social and structure and identity of Buenos Aires at the time. So what I first found out was obviously Buenos Aires was an important port city, so a lot of different people from different countries were coming in. In one of the readings I mentioned, it was Spanish, Italians for the most part, Irish, English, all these different nationalities were coming into Buenos Aires, and their first language wasn't Spanish. So sort of a pidgin slang developed within these communities, these immigrant communities, usually the lower class communities. And so they started it first started out as pidgin slangs in between like the Italian community and the Spanish communities and the English communities. So it was their own dialects that bounded them together as an immigrant community. So all the Italians could identify themselves based on the type of Spanish that they spoke, which was called a cocoliche, which was a mixture. Wait, there was a quote that I found interesting that a grotesque and hybridized jargon that certain Italian immigrants spoke mixing with Spanish. So it was just a sort of bunch-headed monster with Spanish, then all these different languages incorporating themselves into Spanish. And so eventually these sort of specific idiolects grew and they started, I guess, mixing within each other within these immigrant communities and became Lunfardo. So from the individual specific or nationality-specific languages grew the slang of Lunfardo. And Lunfardo eventually grew to represent the sort of identity as a lower class immigrant because it was concentrated in areas like La Boca, where all the immigrants were, where all the people without money were concentrated. So that by speaking Lunfardo, they were marking themselves as lower classes and as kind of connecting with each other on that. And it was different from what was being spoken in the rest of Buenos Aires that was sort of the more proper Spanish, or I guess not necessarily, didn't have the same sort of borrowings and like Italian slang that Lunfardo did. But then eventually, which is the last part of my paper, as Lunfardo became incorporated in tango lyrics, and then as tango itself became propagated and popularized as a sort of product of Buenos Aires, Lunfardo became popularized. And so people who weren't from the lower classes, people who were from different backgrounds, were starting to use Lunfardo. So going back to the theme of national identity, although this national identity was produced in its birthplace by the lower classes and by the mixing of different nationalities, it eventually became used by everybody else and sort of lost that power as a sort of representation of people's social status and like the status of the communities within Buenos Aires and Porteño slang. So it became sort of sanitized and then propagated throughout Buenos Aires and eventually like Argentina as the export of tango. So yeah, and that was pretty much the main point of my paper. Should I ask questions now? Or?